watching my adult children's jaws drop as they realized the pathetic old woman living in a garage had just been featured in Architectural Digest as having one of the most innovative small space designs in the country, and that the people who had mocked my desperate living situation had just discovered I was worth more than all of them combined. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I have something even more shocking to share about what happened next. The moving truck pulled away from my daughter Jessica's pristine suburban driveway on that cold February morning in Portland, Oregon, leaving me standing in front of a detached two-car garage with nothing but 3 suitcases, a folding chair, and the slowly dawning realization that my own family had just made it crystal clear exactly where I ranked in their lives. The exhaust fumes from the truck lingered in the crisp morning air as I watched it disappear around the corner of Maple Grove Lane, taking with it the last remnants of my dignity in the eyes of my children. At 70 years old, Margaret Maggie Chen had just been relegated to living in a garage like some forgotten piece of seasonal equipment. "Mom, it's just temporary," Jessica had said the night before, not quite meeting my eyes as she handed me a space heater and some old blankets that smelled like mothballs and broken dreams. "Just until you figure out a more appropriate living situation for someone your age." Someone my age. Those 3 words had become the refrain of my existence since my husband David died 18 months ago. As if turning 70 had automatically stripped away every ounce of competence, dignity, and decision-making ability I'd accumulated over 7 decades of life. My son Marcus had been even less diplomatic than his sister. "Mom, you can't expect to live in our guest rooms forever. Carol and I have our own lives, and frankly, having you in the house is putting strain on our marriage. The garage has electricity and running water from the utility sink. It's perfectly adequate for your needs." Perfectly adequate. For a 70-year-old woman who had raised them, sacrificed for them, put them through college, helped with down payments on their first homes, and spent the last 2 years since their father's death being shuffled between their houses like an unwanted piece of furniture they couldn't figure out where to store. The conversation that had led to this moment played on repeat in my mind as I stood there shivering in the February cold. It had happened 3 days earlier, during what Jessica had euphemistically called a family meeting at her dining room table. The same table where I'd helped her with homework 25 years ago. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," Jessica had begun, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she probably used with difficult parents at her job as an elementary school principal. "This arrangement of you moving between our houses every few months isn't sustainable. It's disruptive to our routines," Carol, Marcus's wife, had added with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a problematic tenant. Carol was a real estate agent who seemed to view every human interaction through the lens of property values and market efficiency. "What are you suggesting?" I had asked, though something cold in my stomach already knew where this conversation was heading. Marcus had pulled out a folder, because of course he had prepared materials for this intervention. My son, the accountant, always came prepared with spreadsheets and documentation when he was about to deliver bad news. "We've researched several senior living communities in the area," he said, sliding a brochure across the table. "Sunset Manor has very reasonable rates for their efficiency apartments. It's specifically designed for people in your situation. People in my situation. Unwanted elderly parents who had become inconveniences to their busy adult children." I'd looked at the brochure, a cheerful collection of stock photos showing elderly people playing cards and sitting in wheelchairs, participating in what the marketing copy called engaging activities and supportive community living. The efficiency apartments were essentially studio rooms with tiny kitchenettes and shared common areas. "This looks like a nursing home," I'd said quietly. "It's assisted living, Mom," Jessica had corrected, as if the terminology made the reality less insulting. "They have activities coordinators and meal plans. You'd have people your own age to socialize with." "I don't need assisted living. I'm perfectly capable of living independently." But are you really? Carol had asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You've been staying with us for months now, depending on us for transportation, meals, social interaction. That doesn't exactly scream independence. The truth was, I had been depending on them. Not because I couldn't manage on my own, but because I'd been grieving the loss of my life partner of 48 years, and my children had positioned themselves as my support system. Every time I'd mentioned getting my own apartment or finding my own place, they'd expressed concern about my isolation and insisted I should stay close to family. But now that providing that support had become inconvenient, suddenly my need for it was evidence of incompetence rather than the natural result of the dependency they had encouraged. The monthly cost at Sunset Manor is $3,200, Marcus had continued, consulting his spreadsheet. We know that's probably beyond your budget on Social Security, so we've discussed it, and we're prepared to help supplement the cost. Help supplement. They were offering to pay to warehouse me so they wouldn't have to deal with me anymore. I need to think about this, I'd said. Of course, Jessica had replied with false warmth. Take all the time you need. But Mom, we really think this is the best solution for everyone. That night, lying in Jessica's guest room for what I didn't yet know would be the last time, I'd stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how I'd become such a burden to the children I'd devoted my life to raising. When had Jessica stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as a problem to be solved? When had Marcus decided that I was a threat to his marriage rather than the woman who had taught him how to tie his shoes and helped him through his divorce 5 years ago? The next morning, everything had changed. I'd woken up to the sound of voices in the kitchen, Jessica and Marcus having what they clearly thought was a private conversation about my future. We can't keep doing this, Jess, Marcus was saying. Carol is right. Having Mom bounce between our houses is affecting our family dynamics. Emma and Jake are starting to resent having their routines disrupted. Emma and Jake, my grandchildren, ages 16 and 14, who had always seemed happy to see me when I visited. Apparently, that had been my imagination. I know, Jessica replied, but she's being so stubborn about Sunset Manor. She keeps insisting she wants her own place, but we both know she can't handle that kind of responsibility anymore. Can't handle that kind of responsibility. I'd managed a household for nearly 50 years, raised 2 children, and helped my husband run his small landscaping business until he retired. But apparently, at 70, I was no longer capable of basic adult functions. What if we just— Marcus's voice dropped and I had to strain to hear. What if we stop offering the guest room option? Make it clear that she needs to figure something else out. You mean force her to choose between assisted living and whatever other option she can come up with? Maybe she has resources we don't know about. Maybe she'll surprise us. Maybe I'll surprise you, I'd thought, sitting on the edge of that guest room bed. You have no idea. That afternoon, when I'd announced that I had found alternative housing and would be moving out immediately, both children had seemed relieved rather than concerned about where exactly I was planning to go. That's wonderful. Mom, Jessica had said with genuine enthusiasm. Where did you find a place? I'd rather not say just yet. I want to get settled first. The truth was, I'd called my old friend Helen Rodriguez, who lived 3 houses down from Jessica, and asked if I could rent her garage temporarily while I figured out my next move. Helen, who was 68 and understood something about how adult children could be dismissive of their parents' capabilities, had immediately agreed. You can use it as long as you need, Maggie, she'd said. I'll even throw in access to my Wi-Fi, and you can use my kitchen whenever you want. Consider it a base of operations while you plan your next adventure. Adventure. When was the last time someone had used that word in connection with my future? But I hadn't told Jessica and Marcus about Helen's generosity. I'd let them assume I was renting some sad little studio apartment somewhere, which seemed to make them feel appropriately guilty without inspiring them to investigate further. The moving truck had been the final humiliation, watching my few, remaining possessions being loaded into a vehicle that would drive them exactly 4 houses away to a garage. Jessica and Marcus had both offered to help with the move, but I'd declined. I wanted to maintain some dignity in this process. Now, standing in front of Helen's garage with my 3 suitcases and folding chair, I felt the full weight of how far I'd fallen in my children's estimation. 6 months ago, I'd been there grieving. Mother who needed support and love. Today, I was a problem they'd successfully solved by making me someone else's responsibility. The garage was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete floors stained with decades of oil drips, exposed wooden rafters draped with cobwebs, and the lingering smell of lawnmower gasoline and old paint cans. Tool marks scarred the workbench that ran along one wall, and rusty nails protruded from the wooden beams at odd angles. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting harsh shadows across the space that was supposed to be my new home. The utility sink Helen had mentioned was, indeed there, a deep stained basin with a single cold water faucet that dripped steadily onto the concrete below. The electrical outlet where I could plug in my space heater was positioned awkwardly high on the wall, probably installed for power tools rather than human habitation. I set my suitcases down on the cleanest section of floor I could find and unfolded my chair, placing it in the center of the space. Then I sat down and looked around at what was supposed to be my rock bottom. The silence was profound. No traffic noise filtered through the thick garage doors. No sounds of family life from the main house. Just the steady drip of the faucet and the occasional settling creak of the wooden frame. This was where my children thought I belonged. This was what they considered perfectly adequate for their 70-year-old mother. But as I sat there in that cold, empty garage, surrounded by the detritus of someone else's projects and the smell of automotive abandonment, I felt something unexpected, rising in my chest. Not despair, not self-pity, not the grateful acceptance they probably expected. I felt anger. Clean, focused, empowering anger. And underneath that anger, something even more powerful. Determination. My children thought they had finally taught me my place. They thought they had successfully convinced me that I was a burden to be managed rather than a person to be valued. They thought they had reduced me to someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of shelter and attention they chose to provide. But here's what Jessica and Marcus didn't know about their mother, what they had never bothered to learn in all their years of helping me adjust to widowhood. The woman sitting in that garage wasn't the helpless, financially dependent elderly woman they thought they were managing. I was a woman who had been quietly sitting on substantial assets they knew nothing about. A woman who had 40 years of interior design experience they'd dismissed as just a hobby. A woman who had managed construction projects, renovation budgets, and contractor negotiations that they had never paid attention to because they were too busy with their own careers to notice their mother's capabilities. I was a woman who had been accepting their limitations and control because I'd been too grief-stricken to fight back, too lonely to risk alienating the only family I had left, too tired to prove my competence to people who were determined not to see it. But sitting in that garage, looking around at what they considered appropriate housing for someone of my situation, I realized that I was done accepting their assessment of my worth. I was done seeking their approval for my choices. I was done trying to fit into the small, manageable box they had constructed for elderly mothers who need supervision. I was about to show them exactly what their mother was capable of when she stopped asking for permission and started building her own empire. The woman they had dismissed as a burden was about to become the woman they wished they could be. The woman they thought they'd successfully warehoused was about to create something so spectacular that they would spend years trying to explain to their friends how they had been stupid enough to underestimate her. I pulled out my phone, the smartphone Jessica always seemed surprised I could operate competently, and started making a list. Not a list of complaints or self-pity, but a list of contractors, suppliers, and design ideas that had been percolating in my mind for months. Because here's what my children had never understood about me. I didn't see problems. I saw projects. I didn't see limitations. I saw possibilities. And I didn't see a garage. I saw a blank canvas that was about to become the most stunning small space transformation anyone in Portland had ever seen. My children had given me exactly what I needed: complete freedom from their expectations, their limitations, and their need to control my choices. They thought they were punishing me by forcing me to live in a garage. They were about to learn that they had given me the greatest gift of my life, the opportunity to prove that their mother was far more remarkable than they had ever imagined, and it was going to be magnificent. What Jessica and Marcus didn't know as they celebrated solving their mom problem over dinner that night was that the woman they had just banished to a garage was sitting on assets worth $1.2 million. While they saw me as a financial burden who needed their help to afford assisted living, I had been quietly managing an investment portfolio that generated more monthly income than both of their salaries combined. While they worried about my ability to handle adult responsibilities, I had been successfully running my own interior design consulting business for 3 years, a business that had generated over $200,000 in revenue last year alone. But here's the thing about being underestimated by your own children. You learn to keep your capabilities and resources to yourself, because every time you've tried to share your successes in the past, they've found ways to diminish them or suggest you should be spending your money and energy on them instead. When David died 18 months ago, I had expected my children to support me through my grief while I figured out who I was as an individual after 48 years of marriage. Instead, they had immediately positioned themselves as the wise adults who needed to guide their incompetent elderly mother through every aspect of widowhood. The truth was, David and I had been far more financially successful than my children realized. David's landscaping business hadn't been the small operation they remembered from their childhood. By the time he retired, Chen Landscape Design had become one of Portland's premier high-end garden architecture firms, with clients including several celebrities and tech executives who paid premium prices for David's artistic vision. More importantly, I hadn't just been the supportive wife who handled the bookkeeping. I had been David's business partner in every sense of the word, handling client consultations, design development, project management, and contractor coordination for over 2 decades. Many of our biggest clients had specifically requested to work with me because of my reputation for transforming challenging spaces into stunning environments. But when David became ill, I had stepped back from the business to focus on his care. And after he died, I'd been too grief-stricken to immediately return to work. My children had interpreted this temporary withdrawal as evidence that I had never been truly capable, that I had only functioned as an extension of their father's talents. They had no idea that 3 months after David's funeral, I had quietly started my own consulting firm. Margaret Chen Design had begun as a way to channel my grief into something productive, but it had quickly evolved into a thriving business that specialized in small space transformations and historic home renovations. My clients weren't random homeowners looking for generic updates. They were architects, real estate developers, and wealthy individuals who had heard about my work through word-of-mouth referrals. I commanded $150 per hour for consultations and typically earned $15,000 to $30,000 per project, depending on the scope and complexity. The beautiful irony was that while my children worried about my ability to manage my own life, I was helping other people solve complex design challenges that required advanced spatial reasoning, project management skills, and the ability to coordinate multiple contractors and suppliers simultaneously. My portfolio included a 400-square-foot studio apartment that I had transformed into a luxury living space for a tech executive, a historic carriage house conversion that had been featured in Portland Home and Garden magazine, and a basement renovation that had won a regional design award. Each project had demonstrated my ability to take seemingly impossible spaces and turn them into environments that exceeded my clients' wildest expectations. But I had never mentioned any of this to Jessica and Marcus. Why? Because every time I had shared good news in the past, they had found ways to undermine my pride in my accomplishments. When I'd told Jessica about my first big consulting project, her response had been, "Mom, are you sure you're not taking on too much? You're 68 years old, and managing construction projects can be really stressful." When I'd mentioned to Marcus that a client had recommended my work to a friend, he'd said, "Mom, you need to be careful about people who might try to take advantage of your generosity. Sometimes clients expect more than they're paying for." Every success had been met with concerns about my judgment, warnings about potential problems, or suggestions that I should slow down and not overcommit myself, so I'd learned to keep my professional life private while they continued to treat me like someone who needed guidance with basic decision-making. The financial reality was even more impressive than my professional success. David's life insurance had paid out $400,000. The sale of his business had brought another $350,000. Our house, which we'd bought in 1985 for $85,000, was now worth $650,000. Our investment portfolio, which David had been building systematically for 30 years, was worth another $420,000, combined with my design business income and David's pension survivor benefits. I had more money than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. I could afford to live anywhere I wanted, travel extensively, and pursue any project that interested me. But my children had convinced themselves that I was living on a fixed income and needed their financial support. They had never asked about my assets, never inquired about David's business sale, never wondered how I could afford the designer clothes I wore or the high-end materials I used for my own home improvement projects. They saw what they expected to see, a helpless elderly widow who was grateful for whatever assistance they chose to provide. The truth was, I had been quietly building a life that was far more interesting and financially secure than either of theirs. While Jessica struggled with the mortgage on her suburban colonial and Marcus worried about saving for his children's college tuition, I had been debt-free and financially independent for over a year. I had also been developing skills and interests that my children knew nothing about. Over the past year, I had taken courses in sustainable building techniques, smart home technology, and advanced electrical systems. I had learned to use design software that allowed me to create detailed 3D renderings of renovation projects. I had studied feng shui, biophilic design principles, and the psychology of small space living. My continuing education wasn't random hobby collecting. It was strategic professional development that kept me at the cutting edge of interior design trends. While my children worried about my ability to adapt to modern technology, I was teaching courses to other designers about incorporating smart home systems into residential renovations. I had also been building a network of contractors, suppliers, and craftspeople who respected my expertise and enjoyed working on my projects. These weren't people who saw me as a confused elderly woman who needed careful supervision. They were professionals who sought out my business because they knew I paid well, provided clear direction, and created opportunities for them to showcase their best work. My regular contractors included Miguel Santos, who specialized in custom millwork and had worked with me on 5 projects over the past 2 years. Elena Petrov, a tile artist who had emigrated from Russia and created stunning mosaic installations for my more adventurous clients. James Walker, an electrician who understood smart home systems and could make any space feel like something from the future. These relationships weren't casual business transactions. They were collaborative partnerships with artisans who pushed each other to achieve excellence. When I called Miguel about a project, he cleared his schedule. When Elena saw my name on her caller ID, she got excited about whatever creative challenge I was about to propose. But my children had no idea that their mother commanded this level of professional respect. In their minds, I was still the woman who called them for help programming the cable remote. The gap between their perception and my reality had become a source of dark amusement for me over the past year. While they worried about my isolation, I was having dinner with clients who had become friends, attending design industry events, and participating in professional organizations that valued my contributions. While they fretted about my limited social circle, I was part of a community of creative professionals who regularly collaborated on projects, shared resources, and celebrated each other's successes. While they assumed I needed their guidance to make major decisions, I was running a business that required me to make complex judgment calls every day about budgets, timelines, contractor performance, and client satisfaction. The woman sitting in that garage wasn't someone who had been reduced to accepting charity from her children. She was someone who had been biding her time, building her resources, and waiting for the right opportunity to demonstrate her true capabilities. And my children had just handed me that opportunity on a silver platter. Because here's what they didn't understand about garage conversions. They're not desperate measures taken by people with no other options. They're sophisticated design challenges that require advanced spatial planning, creative problem solving, and the ability to maximize functionality within severe constraints. Some of the most innovative small space designs in the world had started as garage conversions. I had a folder on my computer filled with examples of garage transformations that had been featured in architectural magazines, won design awards, and commanded premium prices when their owners decided to sell. The garage, my children saw as evidence of my reduced circumstances. I saw as a blank canvas with incredible potential. 24 feet by 24 feet of space with high ceilings, concrete floors that could support heavy furniture, and the kind of structural simplicity that made creative renovations possible. Most importantly, it was my space. For the first time in 18 months, I had complete control over my environment. No one could tell me that my design ideas were too much, or that I should choose something more practical for someone my age. No one could suggest that I was getting carried away, or that I should keep things simple. I could create exactly what I wanted, using my own money, my own vision, and my own network of skilled craftspeople who understood that age was irrelevant when it came to design innovation. As I sat in that folding chair, looking around the garage, with a designer's eye, I started seeing possibilities that would never have occurred to my children. The exposed rafters could support a loft sleeping area with a skylight installation. The concrete floors could be stained and polished to create a sophisticated industrial aesthetic. The high ceilings could accommodate a dramatic lighting installation that would transform the entire space. The utility sink could be replaced with a sleek kitchenette, featuring European appliances and custom cabinetry. The garage doors could be converted into floor-to-ceiling windows that would flood the space with natural light. The workbench could become a built-in desk area with hidden storage and integrated technology. But more than the specific design elements, I was seeing an opportunity to create something that would force my children to completely reevaluate their assumptions about my capabilities, my resources, and my place in the family hierarchy. I was seeing an opportunity to build something so spectacular that they would spend years trying to explain to their friends how they had been stupid enough to underestimate their own mother. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app. Project, Garage Transformation. Client, Margaret. Chen, budget, unlimited. Timeline 6 months. Objective, create the most stunning small space living environment in Portland, Oregon. Secondary objective, demonstrate to family members that their assessment of my capabilities was not just wrong, but laughably, embarrassingly wrong. I paused the recording and smiled. Additional objective, have the time of my life proving that 70 years old is just the beginning of my most creative and independent chapter. The woman my children had dismissed was about to become the woman they wished. They had the courage and vision to be, and I couldn't wait to get started. Actually, that wasn't entirely true. I could wait because I had learned something important about dramatic reveals over my years in business. The best transformations happen when no one is watching, when skeptics have written you off completely, when the final result is so far beyond expectations that it literally takes people's breath away. My children thought they knew the whole story. They thought they had successfully managed their problem mother by relegating her to appropriate housing for someone of her diminished circumstances. They thought the story was over, but they were about to learn that they had only provided the opening chapter of the most spectacular comeback story of my life. I opened my laptop, the high-end MacBook Pro that Jessica always seemed surprised I could operate without technical support, and began creating folders for my project documentation. Inspiration photos, contractor contacts, budget spreadsheets, timeline planning. For the first time in 18 months, I felt the excitement of a project that was entirely mine. No client expectations to manage, no budget constraints imposed by someone else's financial limitations, no design compromises, required to satisfy conservative tastes. This was going to be my masterpiece. A 576-square-foot space that would demonstrate everything I had learned about design, craftsmanship, and the psychology of transforming environments. More importantly, it was going to be my declaration of independence, a concrete manifestation of my refusal to accept other people's definitions of what was possible for someone my age, in my situation, with my supposed limitations. I started sketching initial concepts, my hand moving quickly across the paper as ideas flowed faster than I could capture them. A Murphy bed with integrated storage. A compact but fully functional kitchen with restaurant-quality appliances. A bathroom that would feel like a luxury spa despite being only 40 square feet. But the real magic would be in the details that my children would never think to look for. Hidden lighting that could transform the mood of the space with the touch of a button. Smart home technology that would anticipate my needs and adjust automatically. Custom furniture pieces that would serve multiple functions while looking like works of art. Every square inch would be purposeful, beautiful, and designed to exceed the expectations of anyone who thought they understood what garage living meant. I worked. I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death. Pure creative joy. The excitement of a challenge that would push my skills to their limits. The anticipation of creating something that would surprise and delight everyone who experienced it. My children thought they had given me a problem to solve. Instead, they had given me the canvas for my greatest artistic achievement. The woman they had dismissed was about to become the woman whose work would be studied and admired by designers around the world. And the best part? They would have front row seats to watch it happen, 3 houses away, completely unable to control or interfere with the process. This was going to be even better than I had imagined. To understand how my adult children could banish their 70-year-old mother to a garage and call it a reasonable solution. You need to understand the family dynamic that had been systematically building since David's death 18 months ago. This wasn't a random act of callousness. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to convince me that I was incompetent, dependent, and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they chose to provide. The transformation in how Jessica and Marcus treated me didn't happen overnight. It began subtly, in the weeks after David's funeral, when I was most vulnerable and least likely to recognize manipulation for what it was. David and I had been married for 48 years. We'd built a life together that was comfortable, creatively, fulfilling, and deeply satisfying. He handled the business operations and client relations for Chen Landscape Design, while I managed the creative vision, project coordination, and contractor relationships. We complemented each other professionally and personally in ways that made both of us stronger and more capable than we could have been individually. When David died after a 6-month battle with pancreatic cancer, I felt like half of myself had been surgically removed. We'd been partners in every sense of the word, business collaborators, creative allies, and best friends who genuinely enjoyed each other's company after nearly 5 decades together. His death left me not just grieving the loss of my husband, but struggling to figure out who I was as an individual rather than as half of a perfectly matched team. During those first months of widowhood, I was genuinely struggling. I was learning to make decisions that David and I had always made together, managing business relationships that had been built around our partnership, and trying to figure out what my life looked like when I was no longer someone's wife, but simply myself. I needed support, patience, and encouragement while I found my footing as a single person for the first time since I was 22 years old. What I got instead was a systematic campaign to convince me that I would never be capable of managing my own life. Jessica, my 45-year-old daughter, had always been what you might charitably call assertive. Even as a child, she'd had strong opinions about how other people should live their lives, and she'd never hesitated to share those opinions, whether they were requested or not. As an adult, she'd become an elementary school principal, a role that seemed to reinforce her natural tendency to treat everyone around her like children who needed constant correction and guidance. Marcus, my 43-year-old son, had always been more diplomatic in his approach, but he'd married Carol, a woman, who shared Jessica's belief that they knew better than everyone else how life should be lived. Carol was a real estate agent who specialized in helping elderly clients downsize their living situations, which meant she had just enough professional experience to sound authoritative when making pronouncements about what was appropriate for someone my age. In the months after David's death, these personality traits had crystallized into a coordinated effort to position themselves as the responsible adults who needed to manage their incompetent elderly mother. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came during the process of planning David's memorial service. David had been very specific about his wishes. He wanted a simple celebration of life at our home, with close friends and family sharing stories and memories in the garden he'd spent 40 years creating. He'd explicitly said he didn't want a formal funeral home service or anything that felt like a somber, depressing affair. But when I tried to honor those wishes, my children intervened with what they called realistic adjustments for your emotional state. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly right now," Jessica had said when I insisted on planning the service myself. "Let us handle the logistics so you can focus on processing your grief." "Mom, you don't understand how much work goes into organizing." "Something like this," Marcus had added. "You're already overwhelmed emotionally, and trying to manage all these details will just make things worse for everyone." When I protested that I was perfectly capable of planning my own husband's memorial service, something I'd done for both of my parents and David's parents over the years, they exchanged those looks. The ones that said they were dealing with a difficult elderly person who didn't understand her own limitations. "Of course you're capable, Mom," Carol had said in the patronizing tone she probably used with confused clients. "But there's no reason to put that stress on yourself when you have children who want to help." Help. That word would become a weapon they used against me for the next 18 months. They took over the memorial planning completely, making decisions I disagreed with and dismissing my objections as emotional reactions that weren't practical or reasonable. They invited people David wouldn't have wanted there, chose catering that reflected their tastes rather than his, and planned a reception that was more about their social connections than about honoring his memory. When I tried to assert my preferences, I was told I was being difficult and not thinking about what's best for the family. When I pointed out that David had specifically said he didn't want a formal, somber affair, they said I was clinging to details instead of focusing on the bigger picture. The memorial service ended up being exactly what they wanted, and nothing like what David or I would have chosen. But worse than the specific decisions was the precedent they'd established. I was no longer considered competent to make important decisions about my own life. The second major red flag came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Jessica and Marcus asked to meet with me about getting your finances organized. They arrived at my house with folders, legal pads, and the unmistakable air of adults who were about to solve a problem that was too complicated for me to understand. "Mom, we know Dad handled all the money stuff, and we want to make sure you're set up for success going forward," Jessica began. "We've been researching the best approaches for widows in your situation, and we think the smartest thing would be to simplify everything so you don't have to worry about complicated financial decisions." What do you mean by simplify? I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Marcus pulled out a printed sheet of paper with what looked like a financial plan. We've researched the best options for elderly widows, and we think you should consolidate everything into simple checking and savings accounts. That way, you won't have to keep track of multiple investments or worry about market fluctuations, affecting your security. I stared at them in disbelief. David and I had spent 30 years building a carefully diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and retirement accounts. They were suggesting I liquidate everything and put it in accounts that would earn essentially no interest while inflation slowly eroded my purchasing power. Also, Carol added, we think it would be smart to set up online access for Jessica and Marcus so they can help you monitor your accounts and make sure everything is running smoothly. Help me monitor my accounts. They wanted access to my money. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully. But I think I'd like to meet with a financial advisor before making any major changes. David and I always made these kinds of decisions together, and I want to make sure I understand all my options. The response was immediate and coordinated, as if they'd rehearsed it. Mom, financial advisors are just salespeople who want to make commissions off your money, Jessica said with the authority of someone who'd clearly done her research. They'll try to convince you to buy expensive products you don't need and don't understand. Mom, you're vulnerable right now, Marcus added, leaning forward with what he probably thought was a concerned expression. There are a lot of people who target elderly widows and try to take advantage of their confusion during the grieving process. We just want to protect you from making decisions you might regret later. Elderly widows, vulnerable, confusion. The language they used made it clear how they saw me, not as their capable mother who had helped manage a successful business for 20 years, but as a potential victim who needed their protection from my own poor judgment. When I insisted that I wanted to handle my own finances, at least until I'd had time to research my options and speak with professionals, they reluctantly backed down. But I could see the frustration in their eyes, and I heard Jessica whisper to Marcus as they left. She's going to make this so much harder than it needs to be. Over the next few months, my children began a subtle but systematic campaign to isolate me from friends and activities while positioning themselves as my primary source of social connection and guidance. It started with comments about my driving. I'd been driving safely for over 50 years, with only 2 minor fender benders in my entire driving history, both of which had been the other driver's fault. But suddenly, every trip I took became an opportunity for them to express concern about my safety behind the wheel. Mom, are you sure you should be driving to the grocery store after dark? Jessica would ask whenever I mentioned evening errands. Your night vision isn't what it used to be, and there are so many distracted drivers out there these days. Mom? Maybe you should limit your driving to familiar routes for a while, Marcus would suggest. It's easy to get confused when you're dealing with grief, and the last thing we want is for you to get lost or have an accident. When I pointed out that I'd never had any driving problems and felt completely comfortable behind the wheel, they would frame their concerns as coming from a place of love. We just worry about you, Mom. If something happened to you while you were driving, we'd never forgive ourselves. The driving concerns escalated to suggestions that I should ask for rides instead of driving myself places. Mom, why don't you call us when you need to go somewhere? We're happy to take you, and that way we know you got there safely. But when I did call for rides, they were often unavailable, too busy, or could only take me at times that didn't work with my schedule. The message was clear. I should limit my activities to what was convenient for them, when it was convenient. For them, they also began expressing skepticism about my friendships and social activities. When I mentioned having lunch with my longtime friend Helen Rodriguez, Jessica would ask probing questions. What do you really know about Helen's financial situation? Are you sure she doesn't have ulterior motives for suddenly wanting to spend so much time with a recent widow? When I talked about activities at the local community center, art classes, book clubs, and social groups I'd been participating in for years, Marcus would suggest that I was wearing myself out and should take things slower while you're processing your grief. When I mentioned new people I'd met or places I'd gone, Carol would warn me about people who prey on seniors and suggest I should be more cautious about trusting strangers during this vulnerable time. Over time, it became easier to stop mentioning my social activities than to deal with their constant warnings and concerns. They interpreted my silence as evidence that I was, indeed, becoming isolated and dependent on them for social interaction. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of their campaign was the way they weaponized concern about my health and mental state. Every minor ache, pain, or moment of forgetfulness became evidence that I was declining and needed closer supervision. When I mentioned having a headache one afternoon, Jessica immediately insisted I should see a doctor to rule out anything serious. When I said it was probably just tension from dealing with paperwork related to David's estate, she suggested that headaches in people my age could be signs of high blood pressure, mini-strokes, or worse. When I couldn't immediately remember the name of a restaurant where David and I had eaten the previous year, Marcus suggested I should consider having my memory tested. Mom, memory problems can be early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. It's better to catch these things early so we can plan accordingly. When I slipped on a wet spot in the grocery store but caught myself without falling, Carol launched into a lecture about fall risks for seniors and suggested I should consider using a walker just to be safe, especially when you're out alone. Every normal part of aging, occasional forgetfulness, minor aches and pains, moments of clumsiness, was treated as evidence of serious decline that required their intervention and oversight. But when I had my annual physical and my doctor pronounced me in excellent health for my age, my children dismissed the positive news with comments like, "Doctors don't always catch everything in routine exams," and "You should probably get a second opinion from a geriatric specialist." They wanted me to be declining, because my decline justified their increasing control over my life. By the 6-month anniversary of David's death, my children had successfully positioned themselves as the final arbiters of what was appropriate, safe, and reasonable for me to do. Every decision I wanted to make was subject to their approval, and every choice they disagreed with was evidence of my poor judgment or emotional instability. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate the master bedroom, something that would have helped me create a space that felt like mine rather than a shrine to my married life, Jessica immediately had objections. "Mom, you shouldn't make major decorating decisions while you're still in the early stages of grief. You might choose colors or furniture that you'll regret once your emotions stabilize." When I said I'd been thinking about getting a small dog for companionship, something David and I had always planned to do once we retired, Marcus launched into a lecture about the responsibilities of pet ownership. "Mom, pets require a lot of daily care and attention. What if you get sick and can't walk it? What if it damages the house? What if it's too energetic and knocks you down?" When I mentioned casually that I might like to take a vacation somewhere David and I had never been together, maybe a cruise or a trip to Europe, Carol immediately began listing all the ways travel could be dangerous for someone my age. Foreign. Medical care, unfamiliar foods, jet lag, walking on uneven surfaces, language barriers. There are so many things that could go wrong when you're traveling alone. Every interest I expressed, every plan I considered, every desire I mentioned was met with a litany of potential problems and reasons why I should reconsider. Over time, I stopped sharing my thoughts and dreams with them because I was tired of being made to feel foolish for wanting anything beyond the most basic, cautious existence. One of the most painful aspects of their manipulation was the way they used my grandchildren, Jessica's son Jake, now 16, and Marcus's daughter Emma, now 14, to reinforce their narrative about my incompetence and emotional instability. Jessica had begun limiting my time with Jake, claiming that I tired him out with my expectations, and that spending time with me was emotionally draining for him, because I was still too sad about Grandpa David. "Mom, Jake needs to be around positive influences right now," she'd said when I asked why he hadn't visited in over a month. "Your grief is really hard on him, and we think it's better if he sees you when you're in a more stable emotional place," Marcus had taken a different approach with Emma, allowing visits but using them as opportunities to demonstrate my supposed incompetence. When Emma would come over, he'd call every hour to check in and make sure I was handling everything okay. "Is Grandma remembering to give you lunch on time? Is she keeping track of the time? Are you feeling safe and comfortable there?" The calls weren't subtle. Emma could hear every word, and the message was clear. Grandma couldn't be trusted to babysit safely without constant supervision. Over time, my grandchildren began treating me with the same cautious concern their parents modeled. Instead of the easy, loving relationships we'd always had, our interactions became stilted and careful, as if they were visiting a fragile elderly person who might break at any moment. To reinforce their narrative that I couldn't handle life on my own, my children began creating artificial emergencies that required their intervention. Jessica would call in a panic about weather forecasts, insisting that I shouldn't drive anywhere because ice storms are especially dangerous for older drivers with slower reflexes. When I pointed out that the roads were clear and the temperature was above freezing, she'd accuse me of not taking safety warnings seriously. Marcus would show up unannounced to check on me after hearing news reports about scams targeting seniors, burglaries in nearby neighborhoods, or health warnings that might affect people in your demographic. These visits were always framed as concern for my welfare, but they served to reinforce the idea that I was constantly at risk and needed their protection. Carol would call with medical advice every time there was a news story about health issues affecting older adults. "Did you hear about the new study on medication interactions in seniors? You should bring all your prescriptions to my office so I can review them for potential problems." "Did you see the article about falls being the leading cause of injury in people over 65? You should really consider removing those area rugs in your hallway." These manufactured crises created a constant state of anxiety and dependence. I began second-guessing my own judgment about simple decisions and deferring to their expertise about risks I'd been managing successfully for decades. The breaking point came during what they called the kitchen incident, an event that they would later use as evidence that I needed constant supervision and couldn't be trusted to live independently. I had been cooking dinner for myself one evening when the smoke alarm went off. I'd been sautéing vegetables and had gotten distracted by a phone call, allowing the oil to heat up too much and create some smoke. There was no fire, no damage, no danger, just enough smoke to trigger the alarm, which I immediately turned off by opening windows and turning on the exhaust fan. But Jessica lived only 2 miles away and had apparently heard the alarm during our phone conversation. She showed up 20 minutes later with Marcus and Carol in tow, as if they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of emergency. "Mom, what happened? We were so worried," Jessica said, rushing into the house and looking around, as if expecting to find evidence of a catastrophic fire. "I was cooking and the oil got a little too hot," I explained. "The smoke alarm went off, but everything's fine. It happens to everyone sometimes." But they weren't listening to my explanation. They were conducting their own investigation, examining the stove, the pan, the smoke alarm, and discussing the incident as if I'd narrowly escaped a house fire. "Mom, this is exactly what we've been worried about," Marcus said, shaking his head. "You're getting distracted more easily, and when you're cooking with hot oil, that kind of distraction can be really dangerous." "What if you hadn't been on the phone with Jessica?" Carol added. "What if the pan had caught fire and you hadn't noticed until it was too late?" "But that's not what happened," I protested. "I was cooking, I got momentarily distracted, and I handled the situation immediately and appropriately. But it shows that your judgment isn't as sharp as it used to be," Jessica said with the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "Mom, Healthy people don't get so distracted that they nearly set their kitchens on fire. Nearly set their kitchens on fire. A minor cooking mishap had been transformed into evidence of cognitive decline and dangerous incompetence. From that day forward, they began treating me like someone who couldn't be trusted with basic adult responsibilities. They started calling more frequently to check in, dropping by unannounced to make sure everything was okay, and expressing increasing concern about my ability to live alone safely. The final straw came when they suggested I should move in, with one of them temporarily, while they helped me figure out a long-term plan for my living situation. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it would be better if you weren't living alone right now," Jessica had said during another family meeting at her house. "You could stay in our guest room while we help you research senior living options that would be safer and more appropriate." "I don't need to research senior living options," I'd said firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of living in my own home." "But are you, really?" Marcus had asked. The kitchen incident, the memory lapses, the confusion about financial decisions, it's all adding up to a pattern that suggests you might need more support than you're willing to admit. There was no kitchen incident, there were no memory lapses, and there's no confusion about financial decisions. You're creating problems that don't exist. "Mom, denial is a common response to cognitive changes," Carol had said in her most professional tone. "Sometimes the people experiencing the changes are the last to recognize them." That's when I realized what was happening. They weren't genuinely concerned about my safety or well-being. They were systematically creating a narrative that justified their need to control and manage my life. Every normal human experience, moments of distraction, minor forgetfulness, preference for independence, was being reinterpreted as evidence of decline and incompetence. They needed me to be helpless because my helplessness gave them purpose and importance. They needed me to be grateful because my gratitude validated their sense of themselves as good, responsible children. They needed me to be manageable because my independence threatened their control. But I had spent too many years building a successful business, managing complex projects, and solving difficult problems to accept their assessment of my capabilities. I knew who I was, what I was capable of, and what I deserved in terms of respect and autonomy. So when they finally made their move, the family meeting, where they presented their research on assisted living facilities and made it clear that my independence was no longer negotiable, I was ready. I had been documenting their behavior, researching my options, and quietly preparing for the day when I would need to choose between accepting their control or proving that they had underestimated me completely. The garage opportunity had been the perfect catalyst. When they relegated me to what they considered substandard housing as a way to force me into assisted living, they had inadvertently given me exactly what I needed: complete freedom from their expectations, their limitations, and their need to manage my choices. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about the consequences of refusing their guidance. Instead, they were about to learn a lesson about the consequences of underestimating a woman who had spent 70 years accumulating skills, resources, and the confidence to use both. The pattern they had established over 18 months, the systematic undermining of my confidence, the creation of artificial crises, the positioning of themselves as wise advisors managing an incompetent elderly parent, was about to be exposed as the manipulation it had always been, and the woman they had dismissed as a burden was about to become the woman whose success would make their treatment of her look not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. The garage they saw as my rock bottom was about to become the foundation of my greatest triumph, and I couldn't wait to begin. After the so-called kitchen incident, my children's campaign to establish control over my life shifted into overdrive. What had been subtle manipulation and gentle undermining suddenly became an aggressive, coordinated effort to prove that I was incompetent and needed their constant supervision. They had tasted blood in the water, and they were circling like sharks. The change was dramatic and immediate. Within a week of the smoke alarm incident, Jessica had produced a printed list of safety concerns that she wanted to discuss with me. Marcus had researched aging-in-place modifications that he thought I should consider. Carol had compiled a folder of articles about cognitive decline in recent widows that she felt I needed to read. But perhaps most telling was the way they began involving other people in their campaign. This wasn't just about convincing me that I needed help. It was about building a consensus among our extended family and social circle that Margaret Chen was losing her capacity to live independently. The first person they recruited was my younger sister, Patricia, who lived in Seattle and only saw me a few times a year. Patricia had always been the more traditional of the two of us, someone who believed that families should stick together and that adult children had a responsibility to take care of their elderly parents. Jessica called Patricia the day after the kitchen incident. "Aunt Patricia, I'm really worried about Mom," I heard Jessica say during a phone conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. "She's having these episodes where she gets confused and forgetful, and yesterday she almost set the kitchen on fire. Almost set the kitchen on fire. The smoke alarm that had gone off for 30 seconds had become a near-catastrophic house fire in Jessica's retelling. I think she's struggling with depression since Dad died, and it's affecting her judgment." Jessica continued. "Marcus and I are trying to help her see that she might be safer in a more supportive living environment, but she's being really resistant to the idea." When Patricia called me later that day, her tone was gentle but concerned. "Maggie, honey, Jessica told me you had a little scare with a cooking incident. Are you doing okay? Are you taking care of yourself?" "I'm fine, Patricia. I was cooking and got briefly distracted. It happens to everyone. There was no fire, no danger, nothing to worry about. But sweetheart, maybe it's a sign that you should consider accepting more help from Jessica and Marcus. They love you so much, and they just want to make sure you're safe and supported." That's when I realized what my children were doing. They weren't just trying to convince me that I needed help. They were building a case with the family that would make their eventual decisions about my living situation seem reasonable and necessary. Over the following weeks, similar conversations happened with my brother James in Denver, David's sister Caroline in Phoenix, and several of our longtime family friends. Each person who called expressed the same gentle concern about my safety and the same suggestion that I should accept help from my loving children. The message was clear. Everyone who mattered in my life had been told that I was struggling, declining, and in need of intervention. If I protested or tried to explain what was really happening, I would sound defensive, paranoid, or, worst of all, exactly like someone experiencing cognitive decline who lacked insight into her own problems. My children had effectively isolated me by creating a narrative that made any objection to their control sound like confirmation of my incompetence. The next escalation came in the form of helpful suggestions about modifying my home environment to make it safer for someone with my changing needs. But these weren't genuine safety improvements. They were systematic attempts to make my own home feel institutional and age-inappropriate, which would support their argument that I should move to a facility designed for elderly residents. Marcus showed up one Saturday morning with a trunk full of what he called safety equipment. "Mom, Carol, and I put together some things that will help prevent accidents and make the house safer for you," he said, starting to unload grab bars, shower chairs, non-slip mats, and what looked like a raised toilet seat. "Marcus, I don't need any of this. I'm not having trouble with mobility or balance." "Not yet, maybe, but prevention is better than dealing with injuries after they happen. Fall prevention is really important for people in your age group." People in your age group, as if turning 70 had automatically moved me into a category of humans who couldn't navigate their own homes safely. He spent the morning installing grab bars in my bathroom, replacing my beautiful framed mirror with one that had built-in safety features and arranging furniture to create what he called clear pathways that would reduce my risk of tripping. The effect was devastating. My elegant, comfortable bathroom suddenly looked like a hospital room. My carefully arranged living spaces had been reconfigured to accommodate mobility issues I didn't have. My own home began to feel like it was designed for someone much older and more frail than I actually was. But when I protested that these modifications were unnecessary and made my home feel institutional, Jessica arrived with backup research. "Mom, we know it's hard to accept that your needs are changing," she said, pulling out printed articles about aging in place and home safety for seniors. "But statistics show that most serious injuries in elderly people happen in their own homes, usually in bathrooms and on stairs. I'm not elderly people, Jessica. I'm your mother, and I'm in excellent health. But you're also 70 years old, and you're living alone for the first time in your adult life. It's normal for families to take precautions to prevent problems before they happen." The language was always the same: normal, appropriate, precautionary. They made it sound like installing medical equipment in my bathroom was a routine part of responsible aging rather than a dramatic response to problems I didn't have. The real escalation came when they began monitoring my activities and creating evidence of behavior that supported their narrative about my declining judgment. Jessica started calling every morning just to check in, but the conversations were clearly designed to test my mental acuity and emotional stability. "Good morning, Mom. How are you feeling today? Did you sleep well? Do you remember what day it is? Do you have any plans for today?" The questions sounded casual, but they followed a pattern that felt like a cognitive assessment disguised as friendly conversation. And I began to realize that my answers were being documented and interpreted as data points in their case about my mental state. When I mentioned that I'd had trouble sleeping because of noise from construction in the neighborhood, Jessica's response was, "Mom, sleep disturbances can be a sign of anxiety or depression. Have you been feeling worried about things lately?" When I said I was planning to reorganize my closet and donate some of David's clothes, Marcus's reaction was, "Mom, are you sure you're ready to make those kinds of emotional decisions? Sometimes people rush into major changes when they're not thinking clearly." Every normal human experience, occasional sleeplessness, routine household tasks, perfectly reasonable life decisions, was being reinterpreted as evidence of emotional instability or cognitive problems. They also began dropping by unannounced to check on me. But these visits were clearly reconnaissance missions designed to find evidence that would support their concerns about my ability to maintain my home and care for myself. Carol was particularly skilled at this kind of inspection. She would arrive with coffee and pastries, positioning the visit as a friendly social call, then spend the time scanning my house for anything that could be interpreted as concerning. "Margaret, I noticed you have some dishes in the sink. Are you having trouble keeping up with housework?" The fact that I had used a coffee cup and a breakfast plate that morning, which were soaking in soapy water exactly as they should be, was somehow evidence that I was having trouble with basic life tasks. "I see you have some mail stacked on the counter. Are you staying on top of your bills and paperwork?" The mail in question was the normal accumulation of catalogs, newsletters, and non-urgent correspondence that any normal person might let sit for a few days before sorting through. But in Carol's assessment, it became evidence of confusion about financial management. "Your garden is looking a little overgrown. Are you having trouble maintaining the yard work?" This was in March, when any reasonable gardener would be allowing winter cleanup to wait until the weather improved. But to Carol, my dormant flower beds were signs that I was overwhelmed by home maintenance responsibilities. Every observation was carefully worded to sound like concern rather than criticism, but the cumulative effect was clear. They were building. A case that I was failing to maintain basic adult responsibilities and needed intervention. Perhaps the most manipulative tactic was the way they began involving healthcare professionals in their campaign, using my normal medical appointments as opportunities to plant seeds about my supposed cognitive and emotional decline. When I went for my routine annual physical, Jessica insisted on accompanying me for support. But once we were in the doctor's office, she began sharing her concerns about my behavior changes since David's death. Dr. Rodriguez, we're worried that Mom might be experiencing some depression or anxiety that's affecting her judgment, Jessica said, speaking about me as if I weren't sitting right there. She's been having trouble with things like cooking safely, and she seems to be isolating herself from family and friends. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been my physician for 8 years and knew me well, looked puzzled. Mrs. Chen, how are you feeling? Are you experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety? I feel fine, Dr. Rodriguez. I'm adjusting to life without my husband, which is normal and healthy. I haven't been having trouble with cooking or any other daily activities. She doesn't always have insight into the changes we're seeing, Jessica added quickly. Sometimes people experiencing cognitive changes aren't aware of the symptoms themselves. The appointment that should have been a routine health check became an exercise in defending my mental competence against claims made by my own daughter. Dr. Rodriguez, to her credit, conducted her own assessment and found no evidence of cognitive decline or concerning depression. But the fact that questions had been raised created a record that my children could point to as evidence that even healthcare professionals were concerned about my mental state. They used the same tactic with my eye doctor, my dentist, and even the pharmacist at my local drugstore. Each professional interaction became an opportunity for them to express concerns about my cognitive function, my emotional stability, or my ability to manage my medications safely. The cumulative effect was that my children were creating a paper trail of concerns from multiple sources that would make their eventual intervention seem not just reasonable, but medically necessary. The most devastating escalation came when they began undermining my relationship with my closest friend, Helen Rodriguez, who lived just a few houses away from Jessica and had been my confidant and support system since David's death. Helen was 68, widowed herself, and one of the few people who understood what I was going through without trying to fix me or convince me that I needed professional management of my grief. She was also the one person who had been consistently supportive of my independence and skeptical of my children's increasing involvement in my daily life. Maggie, Helen had said after witnessing one of Jessica's check-in visits, I don't understand why your daughter treats you like you're incompetent. You're one of the sharpest, most capable women I know. But my children saw Helen's support for my independence as a threat to their narrative about my need for supervision. So they began working to undermine our friendship by suggesting that Helen wasn't a good influence on my emotional recovery. Mom, we're a little concerned about how much time you're spending with Helen, Marcus said during one of his unannounced visits. She's encouraging you to resist help that might be beneficial for your well-being. Helen is my friend, Marcus. She's been a wonderful source of support since your father died. But Mom, Helen is dealing with her own grief and adjustment issues. Sometimes people in similar situations can reinforce each other's resistance to necessary changes. It might be healthier for you to spend time with people who can offer more objective perspectives. Jessica took a more direct approach. She began scheduling family activities and important conversations at times when she knew I had plans with Helen, forcing me to choose between my friendship and my relationship with my children. Mom, we need to have a family meeting this Sunday afternoon to discuss some important financial planning issues, Jessica would say, knowing perfectly well that Helen and I had tickets to a matinee theater performance. When I protested that I already had commitments, the response was always the same. Mom, your family needs to be your priority right now. Helen will understand that you have responsibilities to take care of. They also began making subtle comments about Helen's influence on my decision-making, suggesting that she was encouraging me to be unnecessarily resistant to their help. Mom, we know Helen means well, but she doesn't understand the full scope of what we're dealing with as a family, Carol said during one particularly manipulative conversation. She's not seeing the memory issues and safety concerns that we're witnessing on a daily basis. The message was clear. My closest friend was either not observant enough to recognize my problems, or she was actively encouraging me to make dangerous decisions by resisting their reasonable suggestions. Over time, these tactics began to work. I found myself second-guessing conversations I'd had with Helen, wondering if she was indeed encouraging me to be unreasonably independent. I started declining some of her invitations to avoid creating conflict with my children, and I began to feel increasingly isolated from the one person who had been consistently supportive of my autonomy and emotional well-being. The final escalation came when my children began using financial pressure as a way to force compliance with their decisions about my living situation. They couldn't access my accounts directly, but they could create expenses and crises that would drain my resources and make me more dependent on their assistance. It started with emergency home repairs that they insisted were necessary for my safety. Marcus arrived one day with a contractor who claimed that my electrical system was dangerously outdated and needed immediate updating to prevent fire hazards. "Mom, Mike here is an electrician who specializes in safety upgrades for older homes," Marcus said, introducing a man who looked around my house with the kind of expression normally reserved for condemned buildings. "He's identified several serious issues that need to be addressed right away." The serious issues turned out to be minor cosmetic problems with outlet covers and light fixtures that were functioning perfectly well. But Mike's estimate for bringing everything up to current safety standards was $8,500. "Mom, I know it's expensive, but you can't put a price on safety," Jessica said when I protested that the work seemed unnecessary. "What if there's an electrical fire because we didn't take care of these problems?" When I said I wanted to get a second opinion, they made it clear that delay was not an option. "Mom, every day we wait is another day you're at risk," Marcus said. "We've already scheduled Mike to start work next week. We can't keep putting off essential safety improvements." The work was completed before I could arrange for another electrician to assess whether it was actually necessary. And the $8,500 bill was just the beginning of a series of urgent expenses that began draining my readily available cash. Over the following months, there were emergency repairs to my roof, my plumbing, my heating system, and my driveway. Each crisis was presented as a safety issue that couldn't wait for second opinions or competitive bidding. Each expense was accompanied by reminders that these kinds of unexpected costs were exactly why elderly homeowners should consider moving to maintenance-free living situations. "Mom, when you're living in assisted living, you won't have to worry about these kinds of unexpected expenses," Carol said, after the third emergency repair bill arrived. "The monthly fee covers everything, and there are no surprises." By the time they staged their final intervention, the family meeting where they presented their research on Sunset Manor and made it clear that my independence was no longer negotiable, they had successfully created the perfect storm of circumstances to support their case. They had documented safety concerns based on normal household incidents. They had testimony from family members who had been told I was struggling with depression and cognitive decline. They had created a paper trail of professional concerns from healthcare providers. They had isolated me from my primary source of emotional support. And they had demonstrated that maintaining my home was becoming financially unsustainable due to constant emergency repairs. On paper, their case was compelling. A 70-year-old widow, experiencing depression, memory issues, safety incidents, social isolation, and financial stress, clearly needed intervention from responsible family members who were offering reasonable alternatives. The reality that a competent, financially secure, emotionally healthy woman was being systematically manipulated by children who needed to control her in order to feel important was much harder to prove. But as I sat in that garage, surrounded by the evidence of where their reasonable intervention had led, I realized that they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign. They had been so focused on tearing down my confidence and proving my incompetence that they had never bothered to investigate what I was actually capable of when I stopped seeking their approval and started using my own resources. They thought they knew the whole story. They thought they had successfully managed their problem mother by creating circumstances that would force her into the supervised living situation they believed was appropriate. But they had no idea that the woman they had dismissed and manipulated was about to demonstrate capabilities that would make their 18-month campaign of control look not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. The garage they saw as my surrender was about to become the stage for my greatest triumph, and they were going to have front-row seats to watch me prove that everything they thought they knew about their mother was nothing more than the product of their own need to feel superior and necessary. The systematic campaign they had waged against my independence was about to become the foundation for my most dramatic declaration of autonomy, and I couldn't wait to begin construction. Actually, that wasn't quite true. I was going to wait, because I had learned something important about timing from watching my children execute their manipulation campaign. The most devastating revelations happen when your opponents have committed completely to their version of reality, when they've told everyone they know about your incompetence, when they've based their sense of themselves on being the wise adults managing the foolish elderly parent. My children had spent 18 months building a narrative about Margaret Chen that they had shared with our entire extended family and social circle. They had positioned themselves as the responsible, caring children who were dealing with a difficult situation with patience and wisdom. They thought the story was over. They thought they had successfully solved their problem and could now move on with their lives while I lived quietly in appropriate housing that reflected my diminished circumstances. But they were about to learn that they had only provided the setup for the most spectacular reversal of their lives. The woman they had systematically undermined was about to become the woman whose success would make them question every assumption they had ever made about aging, competence, and the relationship between parents and adult children. And the best part? Every person they had convinced that I was declining and incompetent would have the opportunity to see exactly how wrong they had been. The garage transformation was going to be more than a design project. It was going to be a public demonstration that their 18 months of manipulation had been based on nothing more than their own need to feel important and their inability to recognize capability when it didn't match their expectations. They wanted to manage me like a problem to be solved. Instead, they were about to discover that they had created a situation where their mother could demonstrate exactly how remarkable she was when she stopped trying to earn their approval and started building her own empire. The revenge was going to be architectural, and it was going to be magnificent. The next morning, I woke up in that garage for the first time and felt something I hadn't experienced in 18 months. Pure, unadulterated excitement about my own future. I'd spent the night in a sleeping bag on an air mattress, surrounded by concrete walls and the smell of motor oil, but I'd slept better than I had in months. There's something liberating about hitting what other people consider rock bottom when you know it's actually your launching pad. At 6 a.m., I made my first call of the day to Miguel Santos, my master carpenter, and the first member of what I privately called my dream team. Miguel had worked with me on 3 previous projects, and understood that when Margaret Chen called, with a new challenge, it was going to be something special. Miguel, it's Margaret. I have a project for you that's going to push every creative boundary we've ever explored together. Mrs. Chen, I was hoping you'd call soon. I've been saving my best ideas for whatever you come up with next. What are we working with? A 576-square-foot garage that needs to become the most stunning small-space living environment in Portland. Budget is unlimited. Timeline is 4 months. Are you interested? The pause on the other end was brief. Unlimited budget? 4 months? Mrs. Chen, you just made my entire year. When can I see the space? Within 2 hours, I had my core team assembled. In the garage, Miguel Santos for custom millwork and structural modifications, Elena Petrov for tile and mosaic work, James Walker for electrical and smart home integration, and Sarah Kim, a young architect I'd mentored who specialized in small space optimization. As they walked through the space, measuring, sketching, and discussing possibilities, I watched their excitement build. These weren't people who saw a sad elderly woman trying to make the best of reduced circumstances. These were professionals who recognized a challenging creative opportunity and a client who had the vision and resources to make magic happen. "Margaret, this is going to be incredible," Sarah said, already sketching elevation drawings on her tablet. "The ceiling height gives us so many options for vertical space utilization. We could do a sleeping loft, a Murphy bed system, or even a suspended office area. The concrete floors are perfect for radiant heating," James added. "We can install smart home systems that will make this space more technologically advanced than most luxury apartments." "And these walls," Elena said, running her hands along the concrete surfaces. "They're begging for artistic treatment. I'm seeing custom mosaic installations that will make this feel like a gallery space." For the next 3 hours, we brainstormed, sketched, and planned what would become the most ambitious small space renovation any of us had ever attempted. By the time they left, I had detailed drawings, material lists, and a timeline that would transform this garage into something extraordinary in just 16 weeks. But more importantly, I had something I'd been missing for 18 months. A team of people who believed in my vision and respected my judgment. People who saw my age as an asset rather than a limitation, who valued my experience rather than questioning my competence. As soon as my team left, I made my second crucial call of the day to Jennifer Walsh, a lifestyle blogger and photographer, who specialized in documenting home transformations for social media and design magazines. "Jennifer, it's Margaret Chen. I have a story for you that's going to be unlike anything you've ever documented." "Margaret, I've been following your work since the Carriage House project. What do you have in mind?" "I want you to document the complete transformation of a garage into a luxury living space. But this isn't just about interior design. It's about a 70-year-old woman proving that age is irrelevant when you have vision, resources, and the courage to pursue excellence." "That sounds amazing. What's the timeline?" 4 months, start to finish. And Jennifer, this story is going to go viral. Are you ready to document something that will change how people think about aging and independence? I'm in. When do we start? That afternoon, Jennifer arrived with her cameras and began documenting what she would later call the most inspiring transformation story of my career. She captured the bare concrete walls, the oil stains on the floor, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, all the evidence of what my children considered my reduced circumstances. But she also captured something else. The excitement in my eyes, the detailed plans spread across my folding table, the phone calls to suppliers and contractors. She documented a woman who wasn't accepting defeat, but orchestrating victory. "Margaret, can you tell me what your family thinks about this project?" Jennifer asked as she filmed my initial interview. "My family believes I'm living in a garage because I've lost the capacity to make better choices for myself," I said, looking directly into the camera. "They're about to learn that I chose this garage specifically because it offered me the freedom to create something they never thought I was capable of." "And what are you hoping to achieve with this transformation?" "I'm hoping to prove that competence, creativity, and ambition don't have expiration dates. I'm hoping to show other seniors that they don't have to accept other people's limitations on their lives. And I'm hoping to demonstrate to my children that they have no idea who their mother really is when she stops seeking their approval and starts building her own empire." That first interview, posted to Jennifer's blog and social media accounts, began generating responses immediately. By evening, I had hundreds of comments from people around the world who were excited to follow my journey. "Margaret, you are my hero. I'm 68, and my family treats me like I'm incompetent too. I can't wait to see what you create." This is going to be epic. Proof that 70 is the new 40 when you refuse to accept limitations. I work in elder care, and I see this family dynamic all the time. Thank you for showing that seniors can fight back and win. But the comment that meant the most came from Helen Rodriguez. "Maggie, I knew you had something spectacular planned when you asked to use my garage. I can't wait to see you prove them all wrong." The actual construction began on Monday morning, with what Miguel called the most exciting demo day of my career. We weren't just clearing out old storage and cleaning surfaces. We were preparing the canvas for what would become a masterpiece of small space design. The first week involved structural work that laid the foundation for everything to come. We removed the old garage doors and framed in floor-to-ceiling windows that would flood the space with natural light. We installed new electrical systems that could support everything from smart home technology to artistic lighting installations. We prepared the concrete floors for a polished finish that would look more like expensive terrazzo than industrial flooring. Every day, Jennifer documented our progress and my growing excitement. The blog posts and social media updates began attracting attention from design professionals, home renovation enthusiasts, and people who were inspired by the story of a woman refusing to accept defeat. But perhaps more importantly, the daily documentation meant that my children couldn't ignore what was happening just 3 houses away from Jessica's front door. On Friday of the first week, Jessica appeared at the garage while Miguel and his crew were installing the new windows. "Mom, what exactly are you doing here?" she asked, staring in bewilderment at the construction activity. "I'm creating a living space, Jessica, just like you suggested I should do." "But this is major construction. How are you paying for this? Who are these people?" "These people are my contractors, and I'm paying for it the same way I've been paying for everything since your father died, with my own money." Jessica looked around at Miguel's crew installing custom millwork, Elena mapping out mosaic designs, and James running cable for smart home systems. The scale and sophistication of the work was clearly beyond anything she had imagined I was capable of organizing or affording. "Mom, this seems like a lot of money to spend on a garage. Are you sure this is a wise financial decision?" "Jessica, for 18 months you've been telling me I need to make my own decisions and live independently. That's exactly what I'm doing." But I could see the wheels turning in her head. This wasn't the outcome she had expected when she relegated me to garage living. This was supposed to be my rock bottom, the experience that would convince me to accept assisted living. Instead, it was clearly becoming something extraordinary. "I think we need to have a family conversation about this project," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm going to call Marcus." As she walked away making urgent phone calls, Miguel approached me with a grin. "Mrs. Chen, I think your daughter just realized she underestimated you. Miguel, she hasn't seen anything yet." The weekend brought the first major reveal that would set the tone for everything to come. Elena had worked 18-hour days to complete the first phase of her mosaic installation, a stunning geometric pattern that covered one entire wall and transformed the space from industrial garage to artistic gallery. Jennifer documented the reveal process, capturing my reaction as the protective covering was removed and the full impact of Elena's work became visible. "Oh my God," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Elena, this is beyond anything I imagined." The mosaic was a masterpiece of color and pattern that seemed to make the entire space larger and more luminous. Golden tiles caught the light from the new windows and cast dancing reflections across the polished concrete floor. The geometric patterns created visual depth that made the walls seem to recede into infinity. But more than the artistic achievement, this was the first concrete proof that something extraordinary was happening in this garage. This wasn't elderly, woman-making do with reduced circumstances. This was world-class artistic installation that would be impressive in any context. Jennifer's documentation of the mosaic reveal went viral over the weekend. The blog post received over 50,000 views in 24 hours, and the accompanying social media posts were shared thousands of times. "This is absolutely stunning. Margaret is creating something that belongs in a design museum. I can't believe this is the same space. This woman is a wizard. If this is what she creates in week 1, I can't imagine what the finished space will look like." But the most significant response came from Marcus, who showed up Monday morning with Carol in tow, both of them staring at the mosaic wall in stunned silence. "Mom, how much did this cost?" was the first thing Marcus said. "That's not your concern, Marcus. But Mom, we need to understand the financial implications of what you're doing. This level of renovation must be incredibly expensive." Carol walked around the space, examining Elena's work with the eye of someone who understood property values. "Margaret, this is actually quite impressive, but are you sure this is the best use of your resources? This is still a garage regardless of how much money you put into it." "Carol, this is going to be a 576-square-foot luxury living space that demonstrates what's possible when you have vision, skill, and the resources to pursue excellence. But why here? Why not just buy a nice condo or apartment?" "Because my children told me this was perfectly adequate for my needs. I'm simply proving that they were right. This space is perfectly adequate for creating something magnificent." Could see them processing the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't the behavior of someone experiencing cognitive decline or poor judgment. This was sophisticated project management requiring advanced planning, contractor coordination, and substantial financial resources. Week 2 brought the installation of what James called the most advanced smart home system I've ever designed. For a residential space. Hidden speakers that could create different acoustic environments throughout the day. Lighting systems that could transform the mood of the space with voice commands. Climate control that adjusted automatically based on occupancy and weather conditions. "Margaret, this technology is more sophisticated than what most tech executives have in their million-dollar homes," James said as he demonstrated the various systems. "You'll be able to control everything from lighting to music to temperature, with simple voice commands or through your smartphone." The smart home installation was documented in detail by Jennifer, and the resulting blog post caught the attention of technology reviewers and home automation enthusiasts. Within days, I was getting calls from tech bloggers who wanted to feature the project as an example of how seniors could embrace cutting-edge technology. "Mrs. Chen, we'd love to do a feature story about how you're incorporating smart home technology into your living space," said David Park, a writer for TechCrunch. "Your project is proving that age is no barrier to technological innovation." But, perhaps more significantly, the technology installation was impossible for my children to dismiss as frivolous decoration. This was serious infrastructure that required understanding of complex systems and careful integration with electrical and network systems. When Jessica stopped by during week 3, she found me programming lighting scenes using voice commands and adjusting climate settings through my smartphone. "Mom, how did you learn to use all this technology?" "The same way I learned everything else in my life, Jessica, by paying attention, asking questions, and practicing until I got it right." "But this is really complicated stuff. Are you sure you're going to be able to maintain these systems yourself?" "Jessica, I've been using technology successfully for decades. The fact that you're surprised by my competence says more about your assumptions than about my capabilities." Week 4 brought the installation of the custom kitchen that would become the centerpiece of the transformation. Miguel had designed and built cabinetry that maximized every inch of available space while incorporating European appliances that would be at home in a high-end restaurant. The kitchen measured only 8 feet by 6 feet, but it included a full-size refrigerator hidden behind custom panels, an induction cooktop with built-in ventilation, a convection oven that could handle anything from delicate pastries to holiday roasts, and storage solutions that made every utensil and ingredient easily accessible. "This is like a Swiss watch," Miguel said as he demonstrated the various hidden features. "Every component serves multiple functions, and everything has been designed to work in perfect harmony." Jennifer's documentation of the kitchen installation generated the most engagement yet. The blog post received over 100,000 views, and the video tour was shared across dozens of social media platforms. "This kitchen is more functional than my full-size kitchen in my house. I'm a professional chef and I would kill to work in a space this well-designed," Margaret is proving that size doesn't matter when you have this level of planning and execution, but the kitchen installation also represented a turning point in my children's understanding of what was happening. This wasn't eccentric elderly behavior. This was sophisticated space planning that demonstrated advanced knowledge of design principles and serious financial investment. When Marcus arrived during the final day of kitchen installation, he found me preparing a complex French meal using professional-grade equipment in a space smaller than most people's pantries. "Mom, this is incredible," he said, finally sounding genuinely impressed rather than concerned. "How did you design all this?" "Marcus, I've been designing kitchens for clients for years. This is what I do professionally. But we never knew you. We're doing professional design work." "You never asked. You were too busy worrying about my cognitive decline to notice that I was building a successful business." The 6th week brought what Elena called the crown jewel of her artistic contribution, a ceiling installation that transformed the upper portion of the space into what looked like a starlit sky. Using thousands of tiny LED lights embedded in custom mosaic work, she created the illusion of looking up through a crystal cavern into the cosmos. "Margaret, this is the most ambitious ceiling treatment I've ever attempted," Elena said as we stood beneath the completed installation. "It's going to be featured in Architectural Digest." Architectural Digest. The phrase that would appear in the opening hook of this story was already becoming reality, and we were only 6 weeks into the transformation. The ceiling installation was documented by professional photographers who had been following the project, and the images immediately caught the attention of design publications around the world. Within a week, I had interview requests from magazines, television shows, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to feature the garage transformation as an example of innovative small space design. But more importantly, the ceiling installation was impossible for anyone to ignore. The beauty was visible from outside the garage, and neighbors began stopping by to ask if they could see the space that was generating so much attention. Helen Rodriguez brought a steady stream of visitors who wanted to understand how such an extraordinary environment was being created in what had been an ordinary suburban garage. "Maggie, you've created something that's going to inspire people around the world," Helen said as she hosted impromptu tours for curious neighbors. "This isn't just a renovation, it's art." Week 8 brought the completion of what Sarah Kim called the most ingenious spatial solution I've ever designed. A sleeping loft that seemed to float above the main living area, accessed by a custom spiral staircase that doubled as a sculptural art piece. The loft measured only 120 square feet, but it included a king-size bed, built-in storage, reading nooks, and windows that provided views of the surrounding neighborhood while maintaining complete privacy. "This feels like sleeping in a luxury treehouse," Jennifer said as she documented the completed loft space. "The integration with the overall design is seamless." The loft completion marked the point where the space was recognizable as a complete living environment rather than a construction project. Someone could actually live here, and live beautifully, which was exactly what I intended to do. Week 10 brought the final installations that would complete the transformation. Custom furniture that Miguel had designed specifically for the space, lighting installations that Elena had coordinated with her mosaic work, and technology integration that made the entire environment responsive to voice commands and smartphone controls. The finished space was 576 square feet of luxury living that maximized every inch while maintaining a sense of spaciousness that defied physics. The mosaic walls created visual depth and artistic beauty. The smart home technology provided modern convenience and energy efficiency. The custom furniture served multiple functions while looking like museum-quality design pieces. But perhaps, most importantly, it was a space that reflected the personality, taste, and capabilities of the woman who had created it. This wasn't generic senior housing. This was a unique environment that could only have been imagined and executed by someone with Margaret Chen's specific combination of skills, resources, and creative vision. Jennifer's documentation of the final reveal generated international attention. The blog post received over 500,000 views in the first 48 hours. The story was picked up by major news outlets, home improvement shows, and design publications around the world. "This is the most inspiring home transformation we've ever featured," wrote the editor of Better Homes and Gardens. "Margaret Chen has proven that innovation and excellence have no age limits. This garage conversion demonstrates design principles that could revolutionize how we think about small space living," noted the architecture critic for the New York Times. But the most satisfying response came from the thousands of seniors who wrote to tell me that my story had inspired them to pursue their own dreams, despite family members who had convinced them they were too old, too frail, or too incompetent to achieve their goals. "Margaret, you've given me the courage to start the business I've been dreaming about for years," wrote a 67-year-old woman from Phoenix. "If you can create a masterpiece in a garage, I can certainly open the art studio I've been putting off. Your story made me realize that my family's concerns about my independence are about their need to control, not my need for help," wrote a 72-year-old man from Seattle. "I'm moving out of my daughter's house and getting my own apartment." The final week of the project brought the professional photography session that would provide images for the Architectural Digest feature story. As photographers captured every detail of the completed space, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from abandoned garage dweller to featured design innovator. 4 months earlier, my children had relegated me to this garage as evidence that I needed supervised living. Today, that same garage was being photographed for one of the world's premier design magazines as an example of innovative small space living. The woman they had dismissed as incompetent had created something that design professionals were calling a masterpiece. The living situation they had intended as punishment had become the foundation for my greatest achievement. But the most satisfying moment came when Jessica and Marcus arrived for what they called a family meeting to discuss your living situation. They walked into a space that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel, surrounded by custom artwork, state-of-the-art technology, and design details that spoke of substantial investment and sophisticated taste. "Mom, this is incredible," Jessica said, looking around in amazement. "I had no idea this is what you were creating." "How could you have no idea, Jessica? It's been happening 50 yards from your front door for 4 months. But we thought you were just trying to make the best of a bad situation. We didn't realize you were creating something like this." Marcus walked around the space, examining the custom millwork, the mosaic installations, the sophisticated lighting systems. "Mom, this must have cost a fortune. How did you afford all this?" "The same way I've been affording everything since your father died, Marcus, with my own money from my own successful business that you never bothered to learn about." Carol, who had been silent during their tour of the space, finally spoke up. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. As a real estate professional, I can tell you that what you've created here is extraordinary. This isn't just a garage conversion. This is luxury living space that would command premium rent in any market." "Thank you, Carol. But you don't owe me an apology for not recognizing my capabilities. You owe me an apology for spending 18 months trying to convince me I didn't have them." The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we'd had since David's death. For the first time in 18 months, my children were talking to me as an equal rather than as a problem to be managed. "Mom, we need to understand. What happened here?" Jessica said. "How did we get everything so wrong about what you were capable of? You got it wrong because you needed to believe I was incompetent in order to feel important and necessary in my life. You created a narrative about my decline because it gave you purpose and control. But we genuinely thought you were struggling. You thought I was struggling because you interpreted every normal human experience as evidence of incompetence. You turned my grief into depression, my independence into stubbornness, my competence into confusion." Marcus looked around the space again, as if trying to reconcile the woman who had created this environment with the elderly mother he thought he'd been helping. What do we do now? Now, you learn to see me as I actually am, rather than as you need me to be. You learn to respect my judgment instead of questioning my competence, and you learn to celebrate my achievements instead of manufacturing concerns about my capabilities. The Architectural Digest feature story was published 6 months after I moved into the garage, with the headline, 70-year-old designer transforms garage into luxury living space, proves age is just a number. The article included professional photographs of every detail of the completed space, interviews with the contractors and designers who had worked on the project, and my own account of the family dynamics that had led to the transformation. When my children relegated me to garage living as evidence that I needed supervised care, they inadvertently gave me the opportunity to demonstrate what I was truly capable of when I stopped seeking their approval and started building my own empire, I was quoted as saying. The garage they saw as my rock bottom became the foundation for my greatest achievement. The magazine feature generated hundreds of interview requests, speaking opportunities, and business inquiries. I was invited to speak at design conferences, aging advocacy events, and family therapy workshops about the relationship between family dynamics and elder independence. But perhaps most satisfying was the response from other seniors who had been inspired to pursue their own delayed dreams and resist family members who had convinced them they were too old or incompetent to achieve their goals. Year after the garage transformation was completed, I received a letter that summarized everything I had hoped to achieve. Dear Mrs. Chen, I am a 68-year-old woman whose adult children had convinced me that I was too old and frail to live independently. After reading about your garage transformation, I decided to prove them wrong. I moved out of my daughter's house, started my own consulting business, and just signed a lease on my own apartment. Your story gave me the courage to reclaim my life and refuse to accept other people's limitations on my potential. Thank you for showing us that 70 is not the end of our capabilities. It's the beginning of our freedom to pursue excellence without seeking anyone's permission. Today, 3 years after my children banished me to a garage, I live in 576 square feet of luxury that has been featured in international design publications, studied by architects, and visited by thousands of people who want to understand how extraordinary living spaces can be created in unexpected places. But more importantly, I live as a woman who understands that competence, creativity, and ambition don't have expiration dates. I live as someone who has proven that age is irrelevant when you have vision, resources, and the courage to pursue excellence. My children learned that the woman they had dismissed as a burden was actually more capable, more creative, and more financially successful than they had ever imagined. They learned that their 18 months of manipulation had been based on their own insecurities rather than my incompetence. And they learned that underestimating Margaret Chen was the most expensive mistake they would ever make. The garage they thought was my punishment became my masterpiece. The living situation they intended as evidence of my decline became proof of my exceptional capabilities. And the woman they had tried to control became the woman whose success would inspire thousands of others to refuse to accept artificial limitations on their lives. At 73 years old, I continue to run my design business, travel internationally, and pursue projects that challenge every assumption about what's possible for women my age. The garage transformation wasn't just about creating beautiful living space. It was about proving that the only limits on our lives are the ones we accept from people who don't understand our true capabilities. My children wanted to teach me about realistic expectations for elderly widows. Instead, they learned about the unlimited potential of women who refuse to be underestimated, and that lesson has made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.